All right, philosophers, I want to talk about David Hume's most famous argument against the claim that we can just rationally discover moral facts. This is his argument against it. It comes in the very last paragraph of this section, almost as an afterthought. He says, in every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning and establishes the being of a God or makes observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden I'm surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions, is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. This change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence. For this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation. 'Tis necessary that it should be observed and explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others which are entirely different from it. In other words, how in the world are these people getting ought claims, moral claims, from these is claims that are about non-moral issues? Let me unpack this a little bit. First of all, what does Hume mean by these is statements? By an is statement, we mean a purely descriptive, non-moral, non-normative statement about what actually is the case. Is statements do not include any claims about what we ought to do or should do, or about what's right to do or what's good or valuable. So for example, here are some standard sorts of is statements that sometimes people try to use to derive ought statements. But you could say humans are naturally inclined to preserve their own lives. Or most people don't like to see others suffer. Or punching people hurts them. Or your mother forbids lying. Or God forbids stealing. Okay, now all of those claims, they just make a claim about what is the case, not about what ought to be the case. They say people or God likes or forbids these sorts of things. All right. Then you've got ought statements. And what do we mean by ought statements? Well, an ought statement is a prescription. It's a normative claim about what we ought to do, or what we should do or shouldn't do, or ought not to do, about what is right to do or wrong to do, what sorts of things are good and evil and valuable. All moral claims are ought statements, and that's very important to get in mind. The is statements are not moral, and the ought statements are moral. So here's some example of some ought statements. Humans should preserve their own lives. Every time you see a should, that's an ought statement. Suffering is bad. Now you're making a value claim there about what ought to be the case and what ought not to be. We ought not to punch people, or you should not lie, or we should not steal. All of these are ought statements. Now, Hume's point is that you cannot get an ought claim from any number of is statements. Here's what he says in that last sentence that I read to you. He says, a reason should be given for how this new relation, that is an ought statement, an ought conclusion, can be a deduction from others that are is statements, which are entirely different. And he says, it seems altogether inconceivable how we could validly deduce an ought statement from any is statement. That is, there seems to be no valid argument that goes from non-moral premises to a moral conclusion. Now, that may not be obvious to you. Let me unpack this for you, though. Here are some failed attempts that you might make to infer by a deductive argument an ought claim from is statements. So you might say, hey, look, punching people causes them pain. There's a description of what happens when you punch them. Can't we conclude from that that therefore you shouldn't punch people? Why not? Or your mother forbids lying, or your whole culture forbids lying. Therefore, you shouldn't do it. Or God forbids stealing. Now that's a description of what God forbids. It's a descriptive is statement. And from that, can't we obviously infer this ought claim that therefore you ought not to steal? This seemed perfectly obvious. What's wrong with these arguments? Is there anything wrong with them? Yes. The problem is they're not logically valid. Check it out. In order to make any one of these arguments valid, you're going to need another suppressed premise, which is not spelled out in the preceding slide. So let's start with the one about punching people. It doesn't follow from the mere fact that punching people causes them pain that therefore you should not punch them. In order to make that move, you need premise one here. Premise one says you shouldn't cause people pain. Punching people causes them pain, therefore you shouldn't punch people. Now it's valid. I mean, if you left out premise one, it would be perfectly conceivable that even though punching people causes them pain, you should do it anyway. There's no contradiction or absurdity in that. You need premise one in order to make it necessarily follow here. Now the argument is logically valid. So you think, great, we just proved a moral claim that you shouldn't punch people. Wrong. The problem is that premise one is an ought statement about what you should and shouldn't do. You can only infer these moral conclusions validly if you already bake in some moral premises. Let's look at another example, okay? So back to God. Now, if you left out premise one that I've spelled out here, you don't have a valid argument because it's perfectly conceivable that even though God forbids stealing, you ought to do it. To entertain a irreligious thought, you might think that, well, God commands bad stuff, right? In order to foreclose that possibility, you'd have to add in premise one here. Say, you ought not to disobey God. God forbids stealing. Therefore, you ought not to steal. Now you've got a valid argument. The conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. But again, note that premise one is an ought statement. You couldn't make that thing valid unless you had an ought premise baked into it. You can only infer these moral conclusions validly from moral premises. So here's the bottom line that Hume is pointing out. There are no valid non-circular arguments that move you from non-moral, non-normative, descriptive premises to a moral conclusion, no matter what those claims are about. So let me formalize Hume's argument that he's making here. He wants to say that if reason can discover morality, then ought statements can be inferred from is statements. But ought statements cannot be inferred from is statements. Therefore, reason can't discover morality. Now, at this point, you might be kind of still a little bit perplexed because you might be saying, look, who cares if I can't get these ought statements from is statements alone? What's wrong, you might ask, with deriving moral conclusions from further moral premises? And the issue is that although you can make valid arguments that move from moral premises to moral conclusion, it just pushes the whole question back one step. How do we know that further moral premise? So to use the God example, how do we know that you ought not to disobey God? I mean, you can't physically observe that fact, it seems. And any argument that you want to put forward for that conclusion is going to have to be based on another moral premise. So, for example, you might argue it this way. We shouldn't do things that will lead to our own suffering. Disobeying God is going to lead to our suffering, let's say. So therefore, we shouldn't disobey God. Well, great. I mean, it's a valid argument. It's fine. But here's the issue. What's the question this begs? How do we know that we shouldn't do things that will lead to our own suffering? In order to make an argument for that further premise, we had to make another moral claim. And again, we can't observe that fact. We can't observe that we shouldn't do things that will lead to our suffering. Any argument that we want to make for that conclusion is going to have to be based on another moral premise, and it keeps on going that way for infinity. We never come to any ultimate foundation, it seems, for our moral claims by way of a non-circular argument. At least that is the challenge which Hume's famous ought is argument poses to us.